Hello and welcome, Neko here with another video. And for those who may, if this is your first time watching, I do use a virtual model as part of a presentation. Um, it's kind of like, think of it as puppetry or wearing a costume. It's just that using motion tracking software and stuff like that. Now that that's out of the way, that's going to be relevant later in the video. But anyways, this is going to be my video response to Andy Edwards, who did a video called Posh and Privileged, the working class can no longer afford to do music, which, yeah, of course you can see it up there. Um, and this isn't his opinion, but rather an opinion he saw in relation to an article by The Guardian about, difficulties for musicians to basically to acquire and maintain wealth and have a living wage with their career and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, there's a few points here to go into, such as that bands don't make as much money as people think. Many of them are contracted under a publisher, and so a lot of times publishers will get the bulk of the money, whereas the musicians don't get as much. Um, let's see, just the same, publishers don't make as much in as decades ago, simply because not a lot of people go out to watch shows. Um, I will talk more about that later on because I do have a whole separate video series where I will eventually talk about that. However, that's not the focus of this video, so I'm not going to go deep into it. So, let's see. Now, exceptions do exist about that, but that's from those who do more than music. For example, there's Red Bull Records. They have musicians signed to them. However, the bulk of the money for Red Bull Records, well, because Red Bull, the money comes from the energy drinks, not so much from the musicians. Very interesting story. Anyways, um, he does talk about the rise in digital use and how it is less expensive to have a singular DJ than it is to tour a band, which also includes on the tour technicians and a maintenance crew. So basically, it isn't just the band that's being paid for it; it's also the people who make sure things are running well, as well as parts needed to do maintenance, such as extra wires, tools, and sometimes money even goes into a new instrument if something happens to the old instrument that someone is using. So you have things like that, which adds to the cost, which is why a lot of times musicians don't tend to have the money that they uh, that people would think they would have. Let's see. Going back to Andy Edwards and his response to the article, he does go into how the problem is less about music and more about performance, which is where I both agree and disagree. Now, I agree in that there are people who do such things like, I think one of the things Andy Edwards talked about as a good example is miming. There's a lot of people who do this miming, and rather than, they'll act in relation to a song, but a recording of the song is playing instead of the song actually being performed. Back in the 90s, Milli Vanilli actually got in trouble and became a laughingstock because they did this sort of thing. Instead of actually singing their songs, they would just be on stage dancing. And so we kind of have that with a lot of bands today. Some people see it as acceptable. Now, as to where I disagree, it's that there are those who integrate technology with the performance. Um, I'm sure a lot of people are going to think Blue Man Group, for example, since they do a lot of interesting things along with like spectacles and such. And there's also people who do the whole thing with like digital characters and such, much like what I'm doing with my presentation. Um, I think a more easy reference for a lot of people to know would be the Gorillas. They do a live show, but they have their digital cartoon characters, and that's usually part of the show. So there's like holograms or screens that present the characters and stuff like that. And a lot of other people do the same thing, which rather than like have it using costume and makeup, stuff like that I don't see as a problem. But it does get a problem when people decide to be like Milli Vanilli. Um, or worse, they will have the show be about the technology itself and not the performer, which is the worst case scenario. So there's that. Um, so yeah, of course, this doesn't stop people from doing that, where they make it about the technology and not the performer or whatever acting and singing the performer is doing, or whatever the case may be. You know. Let's see. There's also the fact that those who are miming and those who have used have the technology at the forefront tend to get more attention than those who, at the very least, do sing and act, which in turn have genuine performers at best get insulted. And I say at best because there have been way worse things that have happened when it comes to these performers, especially when it comes to those who basically use a virtual character for part of their presentation, part of the performance, which is also why a lot of them tend to keep their actual identities hidden, you know? Now, outside of this, Andy Edwards also speaks about education. Okay. Now, um, at best, students can have an opportunity to participate in a school play or similar function. For modern students, they will need to pay for a personal teacher outside of the school system. And given what I've heard talking with like some other people who are parents and stuff like that, I haven't talked to any teachers about this. I do need to make that clear. But yeah, when it comes to parents or even those who have like a niece or nephew that they're concerned with, um, some interesting things come up, which is that it seems that there is a problem that comes from the curriculum itself. Basically, it seems that teachers get punished for deviating from the curriculum, despite the fact that a deviation can aid in the education of the students. After all, not everyone learns the same. Some people understand certain things better than others. It's just how things are. Let's see. Add to that the lack of funds, and we have a problem. Not just in music education, but the intellect of the youth as a whole. As for the elites, I have nothing to add. Basically, I fully agree with Andy Edwards in that the elites, they can afford to do everything that those of us in the lower class cannot. They have the time and the money, whereas the rest of us don't. Which is also part of the reason why it tends to take me longer than necessary to get a video out. Because of the whole time thing. And it also doesn't help that these elites end up establishing an unnecessary standard. And I call it unnecessary because there's a lot of things that just shouldn't be standard to begin with, but it is what it is. All right. Okay. I won't talk about wealth distribution because I don't believe I know enough to make a proper statement. Like I have my thoughts, but at the same time, none to really contribute. And I am someone who will disagree with what Andy Edwards said about the whole thing with taxes for the wealthy because I'm going more off of a lot of stories I've heard of this happening to other people, not something that I know personally or something of that I know of, but of people who were in the lower class, but then they reach an upper class. They have, because of their living wages, they're put into a higher tax bracket, and next thing they know, they end up becoming poor again, but this time in debt, which is why I'm against tax increases, because stuff like that has happened and can happen. One thing I can say and fully agree with is that everyone should get into music. Granted, not everyone wants to get into music, but that's not the point. The point is that everyone who wants to get into music should have the opportunity to do so. It's especially great, as said by Andy Edwards, when in reference to Ted Gioia, that we would get different cultures coming together to create music. And Andy Edwards himself references the effect of African culture in New Orleans on music, you know, or some people like to prefer calling it black culture. And in previous videos, Andy himself also speaks of the influence of Native Americans. Basically, those who are outside of the established norms that are set up by the nonsense standards of the elite, basically coming together to create music, which is a beautiful thing. People who are like a family. And this also comes back to the whole thing with me using virtual avatar, using a virtual character for the presentation, because there's a lot of people who do that as well from various walks of life. They bring something from their culture into it and end up doing something. A lot of people usually performing like with passions and stuff like that and their common interests, and which is also why I have this here. Because you got a lot of people who love the video game series Final Fantasy, and with Final Fantasy 14, you got a lot of people, some of which use virtual avatars, some of them don't. Some have their in-game characters to represent them, all which performing a medley based on various songs from Final Fantasy 14. Something that I think is interesting. And stuff like this I see a lot, and I think this is a good example of not just the point I'm trying to get at when it comes to this, but also what Andy Edwards said of people coming together to create music. Although granted the music's already created, it's just that you got a lot of people who love the music performing the music. Alright, so I didn't like the way I ended the video, so I'm basically redoing it. And I didn't fully understood what Andy Edwards was getting at with his video until, because he talked about like love and self-loathing, until I seen his latest video, since this is like a week later. And one of the big takeaways is the importance of catharsis. So that is, I think, the point that Andy Edwards is trying to make, the whole thing of the importance of catharsis and how use that to bring out the art that you want to do, whether it's singing, acting, playing an instrument, whatever the case may be, and it's just catharsis for the artist, but also catharsis for any of the, as they say, consumers who happen upon it and draw upon something through that work. Now, there are a lot of options there, and I already went through all of them. Probably be exhausting for me to go over them, so I won't do that. Although some people may question whether or not the whole thing of a virtual model may be good, but at the same time, you can also have this as an option, which is like what Obi Katie Cat is doing here, which is having a second cam to show what she's doing on her instrument of choice, which would be the electric guitar. And of course, artists can always do mixed media, so not just your music, but much like Itamata Suzuka making music videos and even other such things like movies and video games. There's a lot more I can say, but I think that is the point that I'm trying to make. Yes, there's posh and privileged people who have a lot of advantages, but that doesn't mean you should give up. Now, with all that said, I am Neko, and I thank you for watching.